I'm really pleased to welcome everyone to today's EC Talk series, Amplified Margins, Cross-Cultural Narratives. So this is our ongoing talk series where we explore ideas that challenge, expand, and inspire the frames through which we engage with art and culture. For those who are here for the very first time, EC Contemporary is the UK's foremost institution specializing in East and Southeast Asian artistic practice and the diasporic community in the UK. And this afternoon's event asks a timely and resonant question. How can cross-cultural storytelling expand artistic discourse and challenge dominant narratives? In a moment where the margins often speak with the most urgency, we want to explore what it means to center these perspectives, not as exceptions, but as foundations for shaping collective futures. Our speakers today, as you can see, are two brilliant voices in art criticism and journalism. Vivienne Chow, London correspondent at ArtNet and co-founder of the Asia Pivot, whose work has shaped the global conversation around arts and culture with rare clarity and courage. And Chloe Stead, associate editor at Frieze, whose editorial vision and writing have continually advocated for new and necessary voices in art criticism, particularly through her work on Frieze New Writers. So each speaker will share a short presentation about their practice. We feel that's the most engaging way to introduce everyone about their achievements and what are some of the topics they really care about. And afterwards, we'll move into a moderated discussion, followed by a Q&A, where you will all be warmly welcome to join into the conversation. So without further ado, Vivienne has kindly offered to speak first.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to today's talk, Cross-Cultural Storytelling. Well, thank you so much, Xiaowen, for giving me this opportunity. It's something that I do on a day-to-day basis, but I don't really have the opportunity or have the time to do a stock take of what I have been doing. So I really appreciate this opportunity. So just a quick intro to what I currently do. I see myself as an arts and culture journalist, and I'm also a storyteller, but I tell stories that are based on facts, or I strive to arrange facts, context, interviews in a way that can form a compelling narrative and to get the message and information across so that I can bring exciting new ideas to people and share important stories. And currently I am London correspondent for ArtNet News, and I'm also the co-founder of the Asia Pivot, the newsletter specializing on Asia and Asian art markets, a newsletter under ArtNet Pro. I know it's very confusing. So ArtNet is, for some of you who are not familiar with ArtNet, so ArtNet is an integrated art platform that offers, or that strives to make the art market more transparent. So you can find auctions, you can find gallery sales, and you can find price database where you can search for records of like art auctions. And so I'm with the news team. So that's the editorial arm of ArtNet. And obviously I have an Asian background. I'm originally from Hong Kong, and I joined ArtNet's London office in 21. And with my Asian heritage, then it's also kind of natural for me to write about Asia. But then in my role, I also strive to be an international journalist. And so I cover not just Asian stories, but also global art stories. And my focus a lot of times will be about the art market. So I cover international art market, like London auctions, and so I cover Venice Biennale, but then I'll talk about Asian artists in Venice. So give it a little bit of and a different kind of flavor that maybe people normally don't find in other art publications. And I also cover politics, like UK politics, for example, and the like development or market development, maybe like in Milan, that's what people are talking about. Oh, is Milan going to be the next art hub? And of course, the Hong Kong diaspora in the UK, and then I think the what I love about being an outlet is that because it's such an international platform, we have offices in New York, London, and Berlin, and it allows me to do things that I never got to do while I was in Hong Kong. Like, for example, writing about an artist from the Philippines in the art market context. I never did it in Hong Kong. I never had a chance to do it. But here, I'm actually learning something new every day. And I talk about like tariffs, which is something that bothers a lot of people. But then it's also a very real issue that we are dealing with, on a day-to-day basis. And then I also write about things that I love, which is like celebrities. So I got to meet Murakami, Takashi Murakami. I interviewed Robbie Williams. Like, who would have thought? I admit that I was a big fan of Take That back in the 90s. And I never thought that, oh wow, I get to meet Robbie Williams in person. And in an art context, because he's, regardless of whether his art is good or not, it's a good opportunity to kind of meet him. So I think in terms of like cross-cultural storytelling, I started to think about, okay, it's not just about telling stories, to audiences who are coming from a different background, but then also across like different kind of sectors. Okay, when pop goes is an art, for example, do we cover that, and how do we talk about it? And then also, I'm also a fan of like feng shui stuff. So then I wrote about, if I want to, and feng shui obviously is a Chinese belief tradition, but how do I articulate these concepts, but in an art context? And of course, it's something. So I interviewed feng shui masters about what their predictions about the art market for the year of the snake, and I think some of it actually came true. So basically, what I do is that I just write about stories that I love, that I want to share, and that while writing about it, I just have a lot of fun with it, and. So I haven't really thought about like, do I have to write about something about Asia and then to an international audience? So I didn't really. It's not something that I tell myself to do every day, but I think it started from day one when I began my career in journalism. So this is just the Asia Pivot. That's the newsletter that I do with my colleague Kathy Fans. She's the editor-in-chief of ArtNet China. And so this is a newsletter that was launched in October 23. We cover a diverse topics around Asia, and so it's not just about Hong Kong, China, but also East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and now of course part of the Middle East, because that is like the hot topic right now. I mean, even Art Basel is opening Art Basel Qatar in Doha, so it's a vast region with culturally so diverse that I think it needs to be reported. And so I'm glad that we have this opportunity at ArtNet that we can cover this and in a very specific way. So this comes out bi-weekly to subscribers. So how did I start? So this, obviously very old, it's black and white. This was my very first feature story in my career. So this was published in year 2000. In the South China Morning Post. That was where I started my journalism career. And I wrote about kids going to a Cantonese opera school. And growing up in Hong Kong, I love Cantonese opera. And then it had reached, but then it reached a point where people just don't like Cantonese opera anymore. People didn't care. People didn't know how to appreciate the art form anymore. And I was obviously very young at the time, but then it's a kind of story that I wanted to tell people. But then there's a trick. It was tricky because it's an English language. So how do I tell stories about Cantonese opera practice and the history and the art form to an English language audience? First of all, to my editors, and at the time they were all mostly English or and Australian back in the days at the SCMP. And so I thought, okay, there's no way I can explain all the practice of Cantonese opera in detail in English language. I mean, people wouldn't be interested anyway. But what if I tell a story about, okay, kids are going to Cantonese opera school and they're having fun. And so I think it kind of worked, and I managed to sell the story to my editor. I just said, oh, this is a fun thing, this is what kids are doing. This is like hair play. And it worked, and of course, originally it was in color, so the pictures are really like stunning photos. And I think it was also a way to introduce a traditional performing arts form to an audience who probably have never been to a Cantonese opera performance or probably never heard of it. But I'm glad that it worked. And then I think my career trajectory kind of parallels to the Hong Kong art boom at the time, with West Kowloon, M+, and then the auctions, and then Art Basel started to take place, in Hong Kong. So I wrote a lot about these areas, and quite a lot of the times they land the front page of the newspaper or the front page of a book. That's the business section. So it was also at a time that no one really had a clue how to cover art in the news. I mean, there were art magazines, and so those are specialized publications. They have specific audiences who are already you would expect them to be already well-versed or very interested in these topics. But then for a general newspaper, and also Hong Kong at the time, there was people just didn't have a clue. And especially I think everyone, including myself, so we're all learning on the job, and how to cover auctions, how to cover the West Kowloon, the arts and the politics and the funding, because when it comes to a public project, there has to be politics involved, there has to be money involved, and that in addition to all these artistic practices and artistic directions, it's a very complicated story. So for a long time, I covered these areas at the paper. But at the same time, I also did a lot of film and entertainment. So the choice of stories that I do, I think I kind of have a hunch of what kind of stories that would sell. It sounds kind of maybe terrible because I keep talking about how to sell a story, because you actually have to sell a story when you are working as a journalist. You have to pitch stories to your editors, and they have to buy your pitch, as in, they'll take your pitch, and then so you can go on to write a story. And I have to try to convince them, these stories, they would travel, people would find it interesting, and people would read it. And so for example, this is a piece I wrote for the BBC at some time, quite a few years ago, that was about, Wong Kar-wai in the Mood for Love. Of course, I knew that people would like this story because of the subject matter. And then the other one, that's a hilarious one. So that was a story about, that was a long time ago, I think it was 2010 or something. And it was a story about me going on a movie set visit of this Hong Kong movie in the making, and it was billed as the world's first 3D erotica. And I knew that story would, people would like, what is it? And so I wrote this story about the set visit. It was quite wild. But then this story got picked up by the wires, which is like, okay, Reuters, the AFP, that's how news travel. And then so all of a sudden, this movie was mentioned in all the international news wires, and then they ran by like all media outlets, all newspapers or news outlets across the world. And then one day the producer told me, oh my God, Vivienne, the movie is even like mentioned in like South America. I'm like, wow, good for you. But that also shows like I kind of have a hunch of how to pick stories that would travel. Okay, and then these are just examples of the stories that I did at the time. That was the launch of Art Basel in Hong Kong, and then M+ debates and politics, and also the rise of art market in China. So these were the big stories at the time. And then also for cross-cultural storytelling. So, okay, I try to tell stories about Hong Kong or Asia to an international audience in English language. But then what about telling stories about other people, as in they're not from Hong Kong or Asia, but to an Asian audience? So I made these attempts when I talk about, say, for example, Venice Biennale. Why should people care about Venice Biennale? Because it's a platform, it's a showcase of all these important artists, and also the power play like between it, like behind it. And then the other one is a story that I did about the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, and that was 2015 or maybe earlier. I don't more than 10 years ago, when they were building this huge complex in Berlin, and while it's open now, but then at the time it had quite a lot of controversies. So, and then I tried to convince my editor, so why should we care about it? It's because it's something, okay, even though it's something that happens in Europe, in Berlin, it sounds really remote to Hong Kong, from Hong Kong, but then it actually has a parallel narrative that is parallel to what's going on in Hong Kong, West Kowloon. It's just a different scale, but then behind it, there's a similar narrative like going on. So I managed to do that story and also draw people's attention to, okay, while you're looking at Hong Kong, while you're in Hong Kong, but you should also pay attention to what's going on, internationally. And then also for story, sometimes the same story can travel to different places. So these are the stories about Picasso and the art market. It's just an eternal story. You can always write about Picasso and the art market in different contexts. So I wrote about it for back in the SCMP. That was in 2010, maybe before that. And then for the BBC, that was about 5 years ago. And then this is the most recent one in the FT. So I think a lot of the times, like storytelling is about you. Sometimes it's okay to recycle story ideas. I won't say recycle, but sometimes it's okay to write about a subject, revisit a subject matter, but then you just have to repackage it and fit it in different contexts. And that I find it really interesting because that has, and it also, even though the subject matter is the same, the context is different. So up until now, because like for example, the FT piece is the most recent one. And why do we have to talk about it now? Because there was this huge Picasso exhibition going on in Hong Kong at M+. So it was also like a timely story. And then I also wrote a bit for Quartz, and also Quartz was an interesting platform. It's a business news platform, but then it also accommodates a lot of quirky stuff that I would like to do. And for example, okay, I wrote about Cantonese opera again. I'm such a huge fan. But then this is about this Cantonese opera that was launched at the time as a Hong Kong title, but as a show about Donald Trump. I mean, it's just so bizarre. Cantonese opera of an actor dressed in the Donald Trump image. So it's actually about politics and it's a satire. But then it also has a hook with an international audience because of what's going on in the real world. And so that came out during the first term of Donald Trump. And of course, like, it's some kind of story that people would be interested in. And then the other one is about restaurants at museums. So it was about, so I went to Singapore. It was the National Gallery Singapore that opened like that was still like relatively new. But instead of writing about the art, I wrote about the restaurants. But I thought it was just such an interesting angle to talk about museums and institutions, because they have Michelin star restaurants in the museum, and they really put a lot of effort in creating like menus and recipes to go with the exhibitions at the time. And I thought, wow, this should be reported. And talking about food is something that everybody can identify with. So I thought it was a good angle. And then of course, talking about Ghost in the Shell, and it was a blockbuster movie, something about Hong Kong. There's a lot of controversy going on. So it's just the right kind of topic and context. And I worked for quite a number of years for Variety after I left the SCMP. And so Variety, you wouldn't probably know, is Hollywood. They talk about, okay, the red carpet and the film awards and stuff. But in addition to that, it's essentially a trade publication. So in addition to talking about the blockbusters and movie deals, then I try to talk about art in the context of Variety. So how do I convince my editor that, oh, this is interesting, even though it's about art? So I said, okay, Park Chan-wook, for example, so he's a Korean artist. He is the brother of Park Chan-wook, who's a very famous Korean director. But Park Chan-wook is, he's a visual artist. And he's also a filmmaker, but his film, of course, they're more in a museum kind of setting rather than being in a cinema. So, and then there was also kind of a news angle to it at the time, because he was blacklisted during the Park presidency, and then after everything, and then so he's like back in the scene and started doing projects again. So that has a news pack, and that has a connection to the film world, and so the editor took the story. And then the other one, that one is about Ulisik, who's a very famous art collector, Swiss art collector, and specializing in Chinese contemporary art. And I talk about film made by artists. How are they distributed differently than a traditional, blockbuster? And how the sales network is different. How Art Basel, for example, they have a film sector, and how they are presenting films differently from film festival. So I try to find these linkage and connections among different, to bridge the film world with the art world, and I think it worked for that particular story. And so that's what I have been doing since 2000, and I'm glad that I still have the privilege to be in this industry and keep doing what I've been doing. So thank you very much for this. Yeah, you can follow me on Instagram.
Yeah, that was a really compact, and I know it's not very comprehensive because you've done so much more, but it gives us a good idea of the variety and your talent.
Yeah, definitely have some questions afterwards. My name is Chloe Stead. I am a writer, art critic, and editor based in Berlin, Germany. I actually grew up an hour away from here in Preston, and I guess I was thinking about being from the north of England in the context of this talk today, because I don't want to claim a marginalised identity, but actually, as you can kind of see from this project that I did when I was in London at art school, I really felt very out of place when I moved to London. I think I sounded differently than I sound now. This is like 14 years of Germany, but your accent marks you as different, and kind of culturally, you feel different because you're kind of like around all of these like fancy people. And I think I'm from a family of very engaged people interested in a lot of different things that are great storytellers, but we were not going to like the theatre and like Tate every weekend or anything, you know, so you're kind of in this scenario. And I don't know, I guess I thought that this was kind of like an interesting place to start. And yeah, so I was in London, art school, and I was writing a lot, and I don't know if you can read this, but yeah, I was writing these kind of little short stories about, I guess me really questioning like kind of my identity in this moment. And when I moved to Germany, of course, you kind of like have that again, because I was again in a different place. But I think kind of like with age and some maturity, then you can kind of really start to see that actually as a kind of as a strength, as like a bonus, that you are kind of part of two different cultures or two different kind of countries, and it means that you can kind of remake yourself in a way, because you can decide, do I do this just because everybody else does this, because my friends did this, because my family did it like this, or do I do it because I want to? So you can kind of like pick and choose a little bit in terms of traditions and kind of, I don't know, cultural things that you want to be kind of a part of. After being after being in London, I moved to Hamburg, where I also studied art. I did an MA there, and I spent quite a lot of my time when I was there on this journal, Young, Fresh and Relevant, which was a kind of ironic title based on a talk that I'd seen. And this was a journal of kind of what I was calling at the time art writing, so not writing about art as I do now, but writing kind of as an artwork. And of course, there's always been this history of kind of artists being interested in language, but I felt very kind of much that people kind of misunderstood what I was doing. And there was kind of a few of us in London and then in Hamburg that were writing, whether like little poems or short stories or whatever. And we're trying to kind of make that as part of our art practice. And I felt like people were like, well, aren't you studying literature? Like, why aren't you doing something else? Like, why are you doing this kind of here? And so I decided to make this journal, and I really kind of, I made these posters and I sent them out to different universities and bookshops and all sorts of different things and blogs, and tried to find people that were doing something similar to me, and then basically did this open call where I invited people to kind of send texts that they were working on that they considered art writing, and then put them together in these journals. So this is like 3 different editions. So I think it's a way in which, I guess like throughout my studies and then my career, just feeling like if you feel like something's kind of missing in the world, then you just kind of do it, because who else is going to do it? From Enticed Pages. From Hamburg, then I moved to Berlin, where I did quite a few different internships. But the one that had the biggest impression on me was working for frieze, which was the German English language version of the magazine that I work for today, Frieze magazine, a contemporary art print magazine, and also a website. This is a picture of me at Art Basel in the kind of like magazine booth that they have there, selling magazines during my internship. It was not a very glamorous internship. I was doing a lot of posting magazines at the post office, making coffee, proofreading, getting galleries to send us images for print and stuff like that. But I learned a lot about how magazines work just from kind of like hearing people talk. And I also got to do my first review. I don't have such nice cuttings of my work as yours, but I took this today, and you can see that the blog was very, it wasn't very technically advanced at that time, very few pictures and things like that. But this is just the clipping from the website of the first review that I ever wrote. And I sometimes feel like, as particularly when I was freelancing, that you think like, oh, you're almost like a hired gun, you're like a gun for hire, you know, like you have to pay rent, people ask you to do things and you kind of do it. And sometimes you can think like, oh, I do this and I do this and I do this, but actually looking at this review again, like there are themes that came up in this first, piece of critical writing that I ever did or ever published. There are themes here that kind of have followed me throughout my career. So this is a review of a show at a very tiny gallery, like a physically small gallery in Berlin called Sandy Brown. It was a review of a show that was very purposefully only women. In 2015, of course, throughout history, there's been moments of people doing women-only shows, but I think in 2000 and kind of around the mid-2000s, it became a kind of trend or an interest again that we see until today, basically, of kind of women-only shows. And so even within this kind of 600-word review, I was thinking about the politics of that and how that, whether I thought that was a good idea or not. And I think that other themes are the fact that these were all very young artists that had never been written about before. And that's something that still really interests me. I like to write about people that haven't been written about before. I think it's very, much less interesting for me. Some people really like to kind of be able to do a new spin on an old topic, I think, and they really take a lot of pleasure from that. But I really love to challenge myself in this way of writing critically about artwork that hasn't been written before, right? That you're not just kind of like talking about a kind of received wisdom of like what an artwork means or something. So I think that these kind of like themes definitely like continued throughout my career. Another piece that I just wanted to mention of my, like very early in my career was one that I did for the kind of the website, the blog essentially of Spike Art Magazine, another contemporary art magazine in Berlin. And this was about the fact that I was working in a burger and like an American burger and steak restaurant in Berlin, also through my studies, but in Berlin while I was interning. And from the very beginning of my career, I think, I don't know, for the first probably 4 years of my career, when I was like writing and being published in art magazines, I was working in this restaurant. And I kind of write in this piece about the fact that I got paid better doing that than I would have done working, at the front desk in a gallery or doing any kind of other art jobs. And this was a really interesting piece for me because, it didn't go viral when we think about virality today, but it went kind of art world viral in the sense that like a lot of people shared it and read it and talked about it and also kind of remembered it. There's people that are like, yeah, you did that piece, I remember that. And that was because it was about this almost taboo topic of people talk about it a lot more today, but like that the art world is so horribly paid, if at all, because I also did a lot of free internships, internships where I was not paid, but also the amount of people that have to have part-time jobs or some other way of earning money alongside this art career. People don't want to talk about that because it looks like not professional, because people think like, well, then people won't think that I'm like serious and I'm a serious writer. And I just wrote about the fact that I thought that I was a serious writer, but also I was serving burgers. And the reason that I kind of bring this up now is that it was just really interesting because it was treated almost as if it was very kind of brave to write this story. And it just was so natural to me because I kind of always, I guess, like my dad and stepmom are in the audience and they'll probably laugh now, but I was also kind of someone that just like tried to tell it how it was, or how it was, how I saw it, and I think that that's one of the things that has meant that I've had a successful career actually, or why people have engaged with my writing, is that I just tried to be honest as I could, and this was a conversation that I was having behind closed doors with my friends, and I just wrote it down and published it, which people just weren't kind of doing at the time. So again, I think that that's kind of like a thread throughout my writing. And I guess in a way of like, when someone reads something like this, they feel less alone, right? They feel less like, oh, it's only me that's not being successful. I'm doing something wrong, but it's like, no, it's kind of everybody. So for the past, I also actually worked, it's maybe worth bringing up, I worked for a year at a creative agency that had a website with a kind of like editorial arm, and I won't name them because I'm probably going to bitch about them later in the talk. But I bring this up because they they did interviews mostly, but they were also kind of connected to, they were also working kind of in an advertising space, essentially. And they were in an interesting moment in that they had been very focused on kind of Berlin creatives, and then they were trying to kind of widen and tell like kind of global stories. And I think that there was lots of things that they did right about that, but there was also a lot of things that they did kind of wrong in like how they told these stories or how they were trying to get us to tell these stories. And I think that that's going to come up later in our conversation, so I just wanted to bring that up. But for the last 4 years, I've been working at Frieze magazine, which is, contemporary art magazine that started that was founded in London. You might also know the art fair, Frieze Art Fair, that started a little bit later. And I originally worked for them as an assistant editor, and my job was predominantly to commission exhibition reviews from kind of continental Europe, the Middle East, and the continent of Africa. And I think that that's been a very interesting job for me, because I think immediately you learn that's such a big region, and you learn very quickly that you kind of can't know what's happening. Even with kind of travel, you can't know what's happening in every single city. I can't know the hot young artists in Lagos and Copenhagen and Dubai, you know, at the same time. I can't kind of know all of this. So I really had to kind of very quickly develop relationships with the writers that we already had in this region, or develop new relationships with writers that are really on the ground, and kind of develop that trust, so that I trusted their kind of taste and their interest, and they could kind of come to me with ideas and say, hey, this space is doing really cool things, I think we should cover them, or this artist is doing really interesting things, I think we should cover them. And I do think that what I mentioned before about kind of like being from the north of England, also then, and for some of my colleagues as well at Frieze, one is from Birmingham, another is from Manchester, I think we're all very interested in trying to tell stories, or trying to, in this case, feature exhibitions from outside of the center, if we think of the centers as being like capitals of kind of big countries. And that's always been kind of like very important, like for me, also kind of like, being in Berlin, also telling story, commissioning reviews from these like small Kunstvereins that are doing kind of great stuff. And that, it takes a lot of time and a lot of research. It's like easy to like find like loads of great stuff that's happening in London, because of also how funding, how money is kind of pumped into these countries. There's loads of stuff happening, but to kind of like meet writers and people living in different cities and like find interesting stuff happening elsewhere, you have to really be kind of like have eyes everywhere, and that's something that I learned very quickly in this job. The last thing I kind of like wanted to talk about, just like a kind of quick overview of my career to date, is the Frieze New Writers program, which was started by a colleague of mine, Amy Sherlock, and it was kind of born out of a prize that Frieze used to do, like a writing prize. And I think the thought was that, with prizes, kind of only one person gets the benefit, but that we could kind of help more people. And so the idea essentially at the beginning was that 8 young people interested, or they don't have to be like young, but they usually are like under 30, they have a kind of all expense trip to London where they stay for the weekend and have kind of like go and see shows and have workshops with Frieze editors, and eventually kind of writes a small piece that goes on the website. And I always really liked this idea, and decided to try and bring it to continental Europe. And so we worked with a partner in Bergen at the Kunsthalle there, and did a session. We've done 2 now, so we did one 2 years ago and one just recently. So this is from Bergen. And again, it's, Norway is a very privileged country, but it's also, I think, like the UK and like many other countries, very centered on the capital, very centered on Oslo. So I think to do something like that in Bergen is quite symbolic. And for me, it had a bit of a kind of personal point to it as well, where like I did so many kind of like unpaid or low paid internships. And I could do that because I kind of like had the financial ability to be able to do that. I was also working, but I had very supportive parents that I knew could kind of, help me out if I kind of needed it. And that's, a big, you can only work for free or for less money if you have that kind of, that safety net, essentially, even if someone's not, paying for your entire life. And so to do this, I kind of thought, okay, well, if this weekend workshop means that you get to miss out that kind of internship bit, if we're just giving you all the secrets straight away in 2 days for free, and you don't have to do like work for 6 months for a low pay and kind of glean things while you're doing this kind of menial labor, essentially, then that's a really great thing. So I guess I just want to leave on that idea. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much. We spoke a week ago, didn't we, about the general topics we wanted to touch upon. Then afterward, then you both arrived here. Then you brought those, really great, amazing presentation with you, but each really signifying very different, I think, approach and maybe also, I think, strategies. But I think having this variety is something I'm sure the audience also really appreciate. So I will just dive into a few questions. The first one, maybe a bit broad, it has to do with visibility and representation. I think that already has shined through, both of your presentations, and we kind of get a glimpse of the work. I really appreciate, for example, Vivienne talked about, I want to write about the stories I love, but some of those stories, they maybe at the beginning they seem so niche. So how do I pitch it? How do I make something I believe is critical, important, and to the editors and to readers and viewers, so that they can also resonate with it, right? I feel like I really appreciate that layer. I can see parallel to our artistic programming, for example, right? Foregrounding marginalized or underrepresented voices, but ultimately we're looking at the impact, right? We don't want to tell stories just in a very small way, so only a few people get to hear about them. We want them to reach impact, but how do we do that? So the first question is about, what does visibility mean to each one of you when it comes to underrepresented voices through like art writing or journalism, and what approaches you appreciate or you would recommend, for example, for other writers to consider?
I maybe have something on, I think working for frieze or working for kind of like art magazines, like print art magazines more generally, it is still quite niche, you're speaking to a certain kind of audience. And so I think a lot of the strategies that you had, which I thought was so interesting, and like you were constantly kind of like, how can I make this interesting for the audience, comes from the fact that the audience is actually much wider. So there's like this ability to be like, okay, we don't want to just catch like art world people, we want to catch kind of like everybody, we want lots of different people to read this. And there's something that I kind of like somehow about this kind of already kind of nicheness of working at an art magazine, and especially one like Frieze that has this kind of, it has this legacy in that we kind of like almost have this kind of like ability to be able to say kind of like, well, if we think it's interesting, it's interesting, So I really like that, because I haven't had to struggle that much with kind of other editors in terms of being sometimes you have to fight a little bit to say, there's always going to be this kind of thing where people that are sitting in London or New York think whatever is happening in London and New York is like the most important thing. So sometimes I had to fight for maybe artists that are dealing with kind of certain legacies or like histories in my region. But generally I felt very much that I was able to kind of like feature the artists that I wanted to feature. But in terms of visibility, I think from my point as an editor, or when you work as a writer, you're constantly thinking, okay, is this a story that I could tell? Is this a story I can pitch? But as an editor, I can just say, is a story interesting? And then who's the best person to write about it? So I think a lot of my job is then also kind of like, as I said, like finding the people in these regions, because I really, again, learned very quickly that you simply just get better pieces if it's somebody that has a connection to that place or to that history, or kind of shares an identity with the artist. Like it's not a must all of the time. It's very kind of like dependent, like piece by piece. But there's lots of examples in which you just think, oh, I never would have thought of that, or I never would have thought about that if I was writing about this artist, because somebody else just had that connection to them. So visibility for me is like, it's not just like me being like, oh, look what I do, I make voices visible, but just being like, these people have so much to give me and my commissioning and my magazine, you know, the magazine that I work for. Like you get back as much as you kind of give. So I definitely see it as this kind of like collaboration and this reciprocal conversation.
I think as a writer and as a reporter, I really appreciate this kind of approach from an editor. I think when I was in Hong Kong, I think one of the problems that we had at the time is that there were a lot of parachute journalists.
Exactly, yeah.
And I understand. I mean, of course I understand how news organizations work, and that's just the way it is. And I mean, it's also very demanding for journalists that they're being shipped over to a place that they've never been to, and all of a sudden.
We should maybe explain that a little bit. That there is this kind of system often that. I don't know if you want to.
And so sometimes when there is a news event, then a lot of these international, I think particularly Western news organizations, so they would send a correspondent to a place that they probably have never been to, but then in a very short period of time, they need to really quickly learn about all the context and get to know the people. Then of course, usually they would have help from a fixer on the ground who would help them to make these connections. But then, of course, I think there will always be a blind spot. I mean, because you never lived there before, you've never been to that place. So how do you get those, the cultural understanding, the kind of context that's necessary for your storytelling, or even just as background? But then a lot of the times, probably because of the time constraint or due to maybe other types of reasons, then they would send a foreign correspondent over to another place to cover that story, and so there's quite a lot of limitations to that, and so I think, of course, like for me, then I would think that it would be in the most ideal world, an editor would approach someone who's like on the ground and to report and to write stories about that particular place or from their perspective, because that would be you get the chances of getting a story with the authenticity and the truthfulness. I think that would be the most. I think that's the best way to achieve those. So I really appreciate that kind of editorial approach from an editor. And in terms of visibility, I think coming from where I come from, choosing to tell a story in English language by default, like whatever I write about is minority. And because English language is, it's a global language, and if I tell a story about Asia, then it's only one part of the world, or even within the Asian context, people from Southeast Asia are very different from East Asia and South Asia, so even they don't understand each other. So I think that's also so that's a lot of there are quite a lot of hurdles that I need to overcome in order to get a story or get an idea accepted by an editor. But I enjoy that challenge of like finding the right news hook or a kind of connection that, oh, this is the story, even though it happens like miles away on the other side of the world. But it's something that would also be interesting to your audience, because there is a connection that, even though it's something very different, but there's something that you can still identify with. I think that's the kind of language that I always look for.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up,
Yeah, of
actually, because there was something I was thinking about in your presentation. How do you decide what goes in the Asia pivot and what would be like a story on the website? I mean, they're all on the website, but that's something I thought was kind of interesting. Like, are you more kind of niche then in the stories that you can tell?
In the Asia pivot, yes, because it's already had a, people already know. I mean, we tell them clearly what this newsletter is about. Okay, we focus on Asia, Asian diaspora, and art market focus. So it's actually kind of niche, and so we might as well, tailor this kind of content to people who really want to know about the information. So in the newsletter, so we have a column called the Big Picture. So we write about the major stories about the Asian art, about the art world in Asia, or like for example, during Frieze London, for example, and so I had a column about all the presence of Asian artists during Frieze London at London institutions and also on the market. So artists were featured or shown during the fair week, and sometimes I would also from time to time we would do price analysis. So that's like really specific and very for market readers. And of course we have the news roundup, and we also have a section called Talent Spotter, which we feature artists of Asian descent, whether they are based in Asia or based anywhere else. So I try to create a kind of holistic view of what Asia means and the region that we hope to cover and showcase to our readers.
Great, thank you so much, both. I felt like what you just talked about kind of lead naturally to my next question about editorial power and responsibility. I think we already kind of touched upon the idea of authenticity and also interconnectedness, in terms of a wide region or people from different places, like varied experiences, but still, finding the relevance and able to resonate, with stories from a different place or time. So in terms of editorial decisions and also how that could support like the inclusion of marginalized narratives and the intention behind it and possible challenges in that process.
I think you have to be like very vigilant when you're having like editorial meetings. We're not, for what we do, Frieze is not a huge team. And it's based in, at least for the magazine, there's an office in New York, London, and Berlin. Although I'm the only editor in Berlin at the moment. And so obviously they're particular kind of locales, and people are seeing particular things in those cities. And you have to be very vigilant, and you also have to be very prepared to like call out your colleagues and say, guys, this issue is so New York focused. Like this is not okay, like you have to kind of like push people and say like, yeah, do we really want to feature that gallery again? Do we really want to do this? And so you have to be quite vigilant in like, because you just kind of have these like natural settings that everybody is kind of pushing things that they're kind of personally interested in. And I think you have to kind of try and step out of yourself, and it also goes to what I was saying about like having relationships, like having coffee, setting up Zoom dates with people to be able to kind of like find out what's happening in other parts of the world, and really kind of make sure that the magazine, if you're kind of trying in some way, although it's impossible to have a global remit, then you have to try and you have to really try and do that. So that's, I think, one of the responsibilities, I would say. Yeah.
I think for me, I try to see like both sides of the same coin. Of course, I always want to write about stories that I'm interested in, but then at the same time, I also need to try to think like from an editor's perspective, and also the publication that I'm pitching the story to, because everyone has, every outlet has different editorial preferences or different audiences. So, which kind of audience would be like most suitable for like this story? Then I think it's about like pick and choose like which outlet that I take the story to, and a lot of the times I think if if we get it right, then usually, in my case, it worked.
Great, thanks so much. That was really tremendous. Next, I would like to move on a bit to community and mentorship. I know that you both have quite good like experience, right, with like mentorship programs or training, maybe both as mentor or mentee, in different setting at different time. I also appreciate maybe among our audiences there are aspiring young writers, who are thinking, how can I, write about, really meaningful projects and have my piece, like published and seen, and while, for example, being based in Manchester. So would you like to share a bit more about, especially I guess as a maybe young upcoming writer, or how do they find those opportunities, and also once they have engaged in such a program, how do they maintain meaningful a relationship with people, especially if they're not based in let's say like the hub of where everything's happening all the time.
I've been to several of these kind of mentorship/fellowship program. All of them happen in Berlin.
You're funny.
For some reason.
Well, so we all need to go to Berlin.
And so the first one I ever took part in, it was in 2004. It was a program called Talent Press. It was organized by the Berlinale, the Berlin Film Festival. So it was a program for young film journalists and critics from all over the world. And we had 10 people. It was just so generous. The organizers, they flew all of us to Berlin, and we spent a full week in Berlin during the festival. And we had these mentors, like the publisher of Variety and the film critic of The Guardian. It was. For someone, a kid, growing up in Hong Kong, you just never thought that, oh wow, you've ever had this kind of opportunity, and I think the great benefit for that is to be able to immerse myself in that festival week. And so I learned a lot, and every day we had to produce a lot as well. We printed a newspaper, a small newsletter, every single day for the full week. So that was a lot of work, but that was also great training. And also working with people of your similar age, similar interests from different backgrounds. It also helps to enrich my experience and also all these exposure. And then 2015, I was on this journalism fellowship called IJP Fellowship. So it's a journalism fellowship for international journalists, and in a quite a similar, a very different setting. But I got to work at I worked for Tagesspiegel for like a month. I don't speak German. Okay, I had like A1 level of German, so they don't expect me to write in German. But they were also, the editors there were very kind and very supportive, and they translated my English pieces into German. So and that kind of because of the translation process. So the editor at the time, he was so patient, and he sat next to me, checking every single thing. Or is it what you mean? Is it like a correct way of like phrasing it? So it's just a collaborative experience that I really cherish. And then when I was in Hong Kong, I organized a program called Cultural Journalism Campus. So it was me running a mentorship program. And of course, I drew experiences from the Berlinale Talent Press. So it happened during Art Basel Hong Kong. ran it for 6 years, and every year we also had like 10 university students who were based in Hong Kong. So they were not just people from Hong Kong. They're also like kids from mainland China who are studying in Hong Kong, and then there were like kids from the Philippines and Switzerland. So it was also I also kind of try to recreate an international environment for the participants, and I think the feedback from the participants have been really, really good, because it was also kind of similar program that you have to, like, every day we put out a newsletter, so that was quite crazy, and during Art Basel. But that was also great exposure for young people who never had a chance to go to an art fair, who never met an international artist. And so I think that kind of, I think the working experience, I think is really important, but I also understand it's difficult to have that kind of mentorship nowadays. I think a lot of news outlets, they can't afford having interns anymore. It's not even about the pay, but it's also about, like, we don't even have enough people to produce the kind of content that we need to produce on a day-to-day basis. And we don't actually have the capacity to coach like young people, and also interns. They stay for a few months and then they will have to leave. So it's a difficult situation. But I think at this point I don't have the answer. How to resolve that, and I don't want to sugarcoat the reality. What do you think, Chloe?
Yeah, I would agree. I think it gets more challenging, especially so as I said, I did all these kind of low paid or not paid internships. But then what happened is they didn't start doing paid internships, they just stopped having interns. So that, in a way I was like lucky, because I was in this like strange moment where that was allowed, but even though I was like being exploited, I still got a lot of opportunities. Just from a practical point of view, I would say that there are these mentorship programs or talks like this one, or a little more like webinars or things like that do exist. And from a very practical point of view, I would just follow on Instagram like a lot of magazines and publishers, if this type of things, or newspapers, as many as you can follow, because that's where you'll hear about these things, because they do exist, but you have to like hear about them first, right? So that's like the first thing. I would just like follow as many people as possible and just try and kind of like have it so that if somebody is doing something that could be interesting for you, then you hear about it. Frieze does this program. We'll do it in Liverpool this year, but unfortunately it's already closed. But it will be again next year, so if you follow Frieze on Instagram, then you will hear about that next year, for example. I feel like I want to say something else about that. I think the other thing as well is like, if you do then, get yourself in a situation, like you have to really just like put yourself forward, like if you don't apply, you don't get chosen. And if you're in a situation like that, I mean, at Frieze there was like there's a fine balance, because I think that ultimately when you're in that situation, when you're interning, I think some young people go into it and they're like, yeah, but I have all of these skills, I have all of this knowledge, like I shouldn't just be like posting magazines. But that's actually what they really need you to do in that situation, post magazines, because that's what they don't have time to do. So you have to kind of do the shitty stuff as well, but at the same time, you are putting yourself forward for things. Like there was, the review that I did, the first one, somebody dropped out, and then the editor was like, hey, do you want to go and see a show this weekend and send me something on Monday? And I was like, yeah. And I did it, and it went down really well. But if I'd have been like, oh no, I need a bit more time, that wouldn't have happened. And another piece I did, like the first kind of little mini profile, was that I was in a meeting and we were like sitting around, and it was like an artist that was like very interested in topics that I was interested in. It was about the kind of female experience, female body, and they were talking about it, and they were like, you should write this, like someone young, it should be someone young, someone like probably like a female writer, someone really interested, and they're like going on about this for like 5 minutes, and I just was like, what about me? And then kind of like one person looked at me and then like looked at the other editor, and he kind of shrugged, and then the other one shrugged, and they were like, all right, and it just never would have happened otherwise, and that was, it was like a tricky thing because you don't want to overstep in those scenarios. Like if you're too pushy, it doesn't work. But anyway, just to say that you kind of like, you really have to kind of put yourself forward. It's the same if you're an artist, you know, like you have to, you know, an artist friend of mine, I've had so many conversations with him where they've been like, yeah, and I met this curator and she said that maybe we should get like coffee, but I think she was just being nice. And I was like, who cares if she was being nice? That's her fault. Like if she didn't mean it, she still said it. Like, so you really have to like follow up. And so many people don't do that because they're embarrassed or they think someone was being nice or whatever, because someone can always say no, you know, like people do reach out to me sometimes and, oh, maybe we can get coffee and whatever. And like, sometimes I don't have time. But I'm never angry that someone's asked me to do that. It's always very flattering, you know. So I think that you really kind of just have to kind of put yourself out there in that way. That would be my advice. Although, as I agree with you that it's not easy. The venues have got smaller.
Yeah, and well, be thick-skinned.
Yeah,
that's something we kind of talked about. And I'm not saying that you have to volunteer for every single task, but at the same time, you also have to, I think, having thick skin and not afraid of being rejected. I think it's really important.
I remember I reached out to you for coffee in Berlin,
yeah.
didn't I?
Well, then, you know, then I got invited to this great talk. So it's like these kind of things come together.
Things,
you know?
they snowball, right?
Yeah.
And you don't know before you meet someone what will come out of it. But sometimes you feel like you are on the same wavelength. But let's see, you know. Yeah, and sometimes maybe in the long term, you know, like actually yesterday I was nominating 2 artists, and the last time I did studio visit with them was 2 years ago, but I remember their work, you know, I just haven't got another chance to work with them, but they stay with me, and now I have this opportunity I could put forward, oh yes, that artist will be perfect, right? So I just emailed them out of blue, said, hey, I just nominated you, and they were super happy about it. So.
But someone has to accept you in their studio and not say, oh, the work's not ready yet, or not, you know, not be kind of like, not right now, you know, like they don't have to wait for perfection. You're just like, okay, you're here now, you know, let's do it.
And I've been to artist studios where it's really just a mess. There's no way I could tell which is work, which is not, but didn't matter. Didn't matter, you know, the artist was there, I was there to meet the artist, and very often people think, oh, I have to present my studio in a way almost looks like a finished solo show, but no. Sometimes it's just about getting to know the person. I'm interested in knowing, you know, where your ideas come from, you know, where you grew up, you know, what are you reading, you know, what do you hate, what do you love, you know. Sometimes we talk about politics, we talk about food, we talk about, you know, we can be talking about anything. But just getting back to our conversation, I wanted to also delve a bit deeper into the topic of language and expression. I think especially in this setting, I appreciate maybe many of us, you know, English, for us, English is not our native tongue, you know, we work in this language, you know, we write in this language, but also maybe alongside with other languages or expressions. And I think we previously talked about something about idea and authenticity, maybe over, for example, polish, right? And over maybe form. But I know still for like art writing, it can be quite intimidating because people think, oh, this is a very kind of intellectual form, you know, even to, I think having a scope of vocabulary sometimes can be challenging or seem to be challenging. So would you like to reflect a bit on that? Maybe Vivienne first,
So English is my second language, and my native tongue is Cantonese, and I also know Mandarin, and so working, I think writing in a second language, of course, that took years of practice, and I also, I mean, it's challenging. Every single piece is challenging. It doesn't really get easier over the course of time because every story is different, and I want to tell it differently. You know, I want to do a better job every single time or every day. So of course, and I have to. I work really hard trying to just push myself and to excel. And because I know that is really important in order to, if I want to keep staying in this business, then I have to excel, I have to do a good job. Otherwise, people won't hire me, So that's okay, practical reasons. But at the same time, writing a story about a different culture, in English language, so it's not just a language thing, it's also a culture thing. So I'm actually translating culture. And I find this process, to me, it's really interesting. And so it's not just about the vocabulary, it's about translating these, some of the concepts. How do I convince readers of English language who do not come from, say, the Cantonese opera story, for example. They probably have no idea what this is all about, but how do I make it or shape it or phrase it in a way that, that's easy for them to understand. And so I think this has always been my principle, and but of course and also I think not to be afraid of making mistakes, and it's actually okay. I mean, even if you're working in a second language, like English as your second language, no one is perfect, and that's why editors are there to help you with your story. I think at the end of the day, the ideas and your perspective are the most important. That cannot be replaced. And language is a tool to express yourself. That can always be polished, but your thinking is you. So I think remember that, and I'm not sure what you think, Chloe. Do you agree?
Totally. I always say that I'm more interested in if someone's got a good idea or good ideas, then I'm more. I don't mind kind of sharpening up the language, because I'm an editor and that's what my job is and that's what I'm good at. So I, in my job, then I'm obviously working with a lot of people, or particularly when I was commissioning and editing exhibition reviews, I was often working with people that don't speak English as a first language. So it's probably made me a lot more patient than, say, some of my colleagues, because I'm very used to getting sentences where I really have to kind of move things around and kind of draw it out, because someone's not writing in their first language. But I really never minded doing that, especially when I felt like I was getting a perspective that I wouldn't normally get from that person. There's a limit to that. Some people, I think, it doesn't matter if English is their first language or not, are sending you pieces that you I don't think they ran this through a spell check. There's a certain kind of level in which you can kind of just with a bit of effort, you can just make sure things are spelled correctly. But I don't mind kind of editing things. I think the thing you said about translating cultural experience is interesting as well, because I have writers particularly that are based in Dubai, that I'll write and I'll be like, hey, do you want to cover the Islamic Art Biennale, which is in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia? And I had one writer be like, you know what? No, because I'm going to write about it for somebody else, because if I write about it for you guys, I'm going to have to explain all of these things, because I'm going to have to explain it all. It's going to take up half of my word limit, and I'd rather write it for what she called a local magazine, which in this case was Canvas, which covers that region. So there's a way in which sometimes people get tired of having to translate translate these things for this kind of audience all of the time, and they say actually no, I much rather write for a magazine out of Dubai, because I don't have to explain all of these things to people. And I had this funny experience once quite early in my career, just a small thing where there was an exhibition in Berlin with an artist that was working with, she kind of made these bodies cut out of kind of carpet, and that she was dyeing, and they were it felt quite violent, it felt quite violent to have been done against these kind of bodies. And I kind of read this immediately as somebody that kind of grew up down the road from a disused mill, I immediately was like, oh, this is about the kind of change from like cottage industries to kind of like industrial revolution. And my editor, who's from Honduras, was like, what are you talking about? Like, Like, and then so we had to kind of have this back and forth where it's like, well, do you take it out, or do you then try and explain, or do you just kind of try and preface it, like kind of add a qualifier where you say, as somebody from this region, this is what I saw in this, you know? But it's like the way in which like you read things differently depending where you're from, but also then you have to explain differently depending on who your audience is as well, I think is yeah, that kind of translation thing. But yeah, I definitely don't think that your kind of English has to be like perfect. It's more kind of just about, yeah, about ideas, I would say.
Yeah, I'm sure that's really reassuring, you know, to hear, I think, especially for young writers and also artists who increasingly need to write more, right? Statement, research, grant applications, writing. I know so many artists, they spend more time writing than actually making work because they need to find the resources to make work through writing, which is essential. Then I think maybe one more question from me before we open the floor. I think we also kind of touched upon like regional, maybe prejudice in some ways, and also global platforms. I feel like we may be agreeing that, you know, the idea of talking about cross-cultural narratives maybe have to do with the need to challenge assumptions, and maybe as, you know, creatives and also people who work in this field, we constantly ask ourselves, you know, can we do more? You know, can we do more? And what can we do? You know, in a very maybe particular moment. You know, so yeah. So for example, do you feel like institutions and publishers, they are doing enough? You know, in which areas they need to do more? Sometimes is it a bit more service level? You know, changes like, or maybe is it not enough? You know, kind of engaging with the authentic or right voices. How can we do more, or how can we do better?
We talked a little bit about this in our pre-chat about diversity or lack thereof in publishing, which but I think it's always this question of like money, right? Because at the same time that magazines are actually, that's why I do think it's kind of like this back and forth, because magazines aren't just trying to be more diverse or like have more diverse staff because they think it looks good. They're doing it because the art world is so much more diverse, and they need people that can reflect that art world back, you know. So I think that there is this back and forth in that like magazines also need to be more diverse because the art world is expanded, is so global in a way that it wasn't before. But I think one of the things that we talked about is that I think that there's more diverse freelancers, but the jobs, like the very rare jobs like mine, where you're like an editor with like a salary, are still very predominantly white, I think.
Yeah, that's a recent survey I came across, which I told you guys before. So it's a survey that's kind of co-presented by the Reuters Journalism Institute at the Oxford University. And so they do it kind of annually, and I went to the launch a couple of weeks ago, and so they survey journalists in the UK, and I knew about the situation. I was aware of that, but I didn't know about the numbers until I was there. So only 1% of journalists in the UK are black, 3% Asia or / Asian British, and then 5% or just a small percentage of other ethnicities, and then the rest of them is white. That's like more than 70%, close to 80%. And I noticed that when I go to press events in London, for example, that I'm often the only or like a handful of East Asian person sitting in a press lunch, for example. And obviously that's something that I never experienced while I was in Hong Kong, because everybody looks the same. But then here I noticed it is something that it never occurred to me. So I think at first I found it quite daunting to be in that kind of situation. But then of course, like over time, I kind of got used to it, and I think for me, of course, I ask myself like questions like all the time. But instead of questioning what I lack, I ask myself what I can offer, what kind of different perspectives I can bring to people, and one important thing is I don't pigeonhole myself with writing just about Asian stories. So I cover like politics in the UK or like interview artists from different parts of the world, because I believe that I can contribute different perspectives or even like create different narratives that can enrich whatever that's being discussed, like currently. So I think that's what I try to do, and I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but I think it's a different kind of process and a challenging process, but it's a challenge that I'm willing to take.
That's a really generous answer and feedback, I feel. Yeah. Well, thank you both so much, and I feel I have learned a lot. I have more questions, but I would ask in private because I want to open the floor to our audience. Please feel free. Yeah.
Yes, thanks so much for sharing.
Would it be possible to we just have the mic? It's just for the audio recording. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives. I think that was really valuable. I was just kind of wondering how you think the cross-cultural storytelling has changed over the last few years. So, for example, with your first piece kind of in early 2000s compared to now with social media, globalization, people are a bit more exposed maybe to cultures that they didn't have access to before, and how has that influenced your storytelling?
I think that you kind of educate audiences in a way. I think something that maybe less about cross-cultural, but maybe more about certain kind of ideas, or feeding certain kind of I don't know if ideas is the right word, but one thing I just think about is that when I was working at this creative agency, if somebody went by they them pronouns, you had to qualify that within the text, because there was a thought that people wouldn't understand what you meant, or they would think it was like an error. So you would have to be in brackets, so-and-so artist prefers, you would have to explain this kind of thing, and you don't do that anymore. So that's just the small ways in which in very quick moments, language can change, or how one uses language within a magazine. So that's a very kind of nitpicky editing answer to that question, I guess. I don't know if you have more of a kind of bigger view.
I think you're absolutely right. I think the cultural exposure today is obviously very different. So one of the pieces I talked about was the interview with Murakami, and he talked about, of course, super flat and influences, his cultural influences, for example, anime and TV series and pop culture. And I think if I had to write about that, 20 years ago, then of course I have to explain every single thing. But then now, I don't really have to. And I actually talked about that in that story. So it's a piece that is a hybrid of an interview / some kind of observation or cultural commentary. And I talked about how back in the days, because he talks a lot about anime and manga, and in that piece I talked about how anime and manga has come from being a subculture from decades ago in the Western context, to basically you go to Waterstone, every single Waterstone has a shelf of manga. It's the mainstream of young people today. So the kind of acceptance, I think the kind of acceptance and also the cultural diversity is so different now, and I think it provides a great advantage to people who want to tell different stories, and especially stories about different cultures. And the acceptance is so much higher. Like, you don't have to explain too much about Korean stuff now, for example. I mean, there are Korean supermarkets, like, every street corner. And so I think it brings advantage today. And it's just, but it's not easier, but then it just allows more room for diversity.
I think artists also do like part of our job here as well, right? Because I think that there are certain artists that get platforms and they really use that platform to kind of like educate audiences or like viewers to their own work, and then also really try and be like, I'm not going to be up here alone. I also want to kind of like help other artists kind of get to that point, so that you then at some point an artist, a famous artist from a region, but also just thinking about like Christian Sung Kim, who is a deaf artist living in Berlin from LA, who kind of like everything that she does, she's really kind of explaining this idea of kind of like deaf identity and kind of championing other artists and deaf creatives. And kind of like doing that educational work in a way for us, so that the first article that you maybe do about her might have to explain all of these terms. The fact that, for example, she uses deaf with like a capital D because she sees it as like a cultural identity. And then 4 pieces later, you don't have to do that anymore because people kind of already, somebody has kind of risen to a level that people already know who they are and they know things about them. So I think that, artists also kind of like do a lot in terms of these like cross-cultural dialogues that you said. That was a great question, thank you.
Yeah, Peter, you look like you have a question.
Yes, I do have more of a practical question. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you so much to both of you. It's been absolute gold dust, from your careers into the art world, and I can definitely identify with your entrance into the art world, to internships and mentoring and everything else. But you both talked a little bit about pitching to your editors. How do you feel being pitched to? And the reason I'm asking is I have a background in art auctioneering. It was never an issue to get any press. Modern contemporary art, we always had people wanting to write, so I never had to go out. I pivoted to working in publicly funded arts organisations where, on the whole, there are no press teams and very small marketing teams. And I think I'm speaking for many organisations here, including esea. We need to go out and get the stories out. So either we work with PR agencies and that costs money, or we spend a lot of time, great time, building relationships. Because I think, it is all about the relationships. But how do you feel being pitched to when there are so many organisations, so many artists, so many story angles? And do you have any tips for
more like institutions than writers?
Yeah, small people who can't afford big PR agencies.
The issue is always you get so many emails, and it's really impossible to kind of like follow up with everything. So it's just like you are so inundated with information. And unfortunately, like PR companies, because, I really wish that they had less power than they do. But they have the contacts and they have these people who are like, they're employed to be very, very pushy. But I guess it's maybe about really like tailoring things as well, and really kind of like doing your research, which of course takes time. But I think it's like finding out what like editors and writers like do and what their topics and interests are, and trying to kind of like send things to them that you think are kind of interesting. Everybody is susceptible to flattery. So, if someone's sending you, it's true. If someone's sending you an email and they're like, oh, I read this piece that you did that I really loved, and I just thought like, I work at this institution and we have the show of this, and I just thought it was so relevant to you. And of course you can't do that all the time for everything, but I think that's one way to kind of get your foot in the door. I think if you get pitched something that feels really like specific to your interests, that very much helps. I always say to artists when they're trying to, really Instagram is like such a great tool in terms of just kind of like following people. It's not the only one, there's like other platforms as well, of course, but like in kind of flattening hierarchies. Because you can follow, like all freelance writers are like on Instagram, you know, so when you kind of like are flicking through a magazine and you see someone's name and you see something that they wrote that you like, you can kind of follow them. And I think it's quite easy through that platform to kind of like make relationships like with people, and then you already have your foot in the door a little bit, because at first you need the attention, and then that's the beginning of the relationship, and then you continue with this relationship by going for coffee or whatever it is that you do, having a Zoom date.
Yeah, I think I share Chloe's view. I get so many emails every day, and I honestly, there's no way I can read every single one of them. And a lot of the times, okay, how do I decide which emails to open? It really depends on the subject line. Because I have to screen like a ton of emails every day, and so I think if you send by email, then of course I think that the email subject line is really important, and capital letters. If you write your email subject line in all caps, it doesn't necessarily help. It doesn't make it more important, but a lot of people do that. But I totally agree, because there are a lot of writers and like journalists around, and I think each of us has specific interest and strength and stories that we want to tell. So if you can, I think if people can look into like which writer does kind of what, and you can kind of get a taste of what kind of stories that they would be really interested in covering, then and then tailor a pitch to them. I think that would be I think that's already, I think half the work is already done.
I think just one other small thing is that some institutions, of course, you would need like a little bit of budget, but there's things like little kind of like writing residencies that institutions do, where they'll say, hey, we have a small kind of like fee for you, and then you would find kind of like a local writer, for example, you know, you would do an open call, and then you would have someone come and say like, oh, we have this spare apartment or whatever, you know, we have this room that you can work in, or we have a spare apartment, or we have this or that we can offer you in a small fee, and in your residency, then you'll spend time in the museum or wherever and write a text about it, for example, that then goes on the website, and then like you're really developing. Sometimes you kind of like go kind of aim high for, I don't know, the chief editor of a magazine or something, but actually like the young writers of today will be the chief editors of the magazines in the future. So I think you can also kind of start on like a local basis, or start with kind of younger emerging writers and kind of build your way up from there, because I think that loyalty is a big thing as well. I think that if you support people early in their career, or you kind of make these relationships at the beginning, you have this kind of loyalties to certain kind of institutions that you felt like supported you or helped you.
Yeah, those
Absolutely.
are some really practical and insightful tips. Yeah. Any further questions?
I won't ask you, Chloe, don't worry. With Vivienne, so when listening to you describing how obviously English is your second language, and obviously predominantly you had to write in English for a few pieces, do you sometimes feel that compromises your piece, rather than, you know, does it limit your ability to express your feelings about a particular subject? I'm just sort of comparing it to if someone paints a picture, I assume that it transcends language. Every one of us, regardless of what our first language is, can look at a picture and decide what our view is, whereas you're maybe, I'm just wondering whether having to translate something into English just limits and possibly compromises your piece a little bit.
I wouldn't say compromise. It's I just need to constantly look for new expressions, or it's kind of, maybe sometimes I need to find ways, like kind of reinvent some kind of expressions. I think the translation comes when I write about something that comes from a non-English language culture, and but then when I'm writing something, say for example an exhibition review, I'll just describe it and I'll try to articulate it just the way it is. And but then a lot of the times when, of course, that kind of translation would happen more often when I'm, say, for example, writing about Chinese artists, and I interview an artist in either in Cantonese or in Mandarin, and then translating their words and way of thinking into English. So the translating culture part would happen like in this kind of situation. And of course, that will always be lost in translation. It's a very real thing. But then at the same time, I take it as an opportunity to kind of experiment with words in English to try to find ways that can, kind of equivalent to what they're saying, like originally in either Cantonese or in Mandarin, and also put it in a way that readers of English language can also understand or have a glimpse of their world. So I wouldn't say that's a compromise. It's just but extra work needs to be done.
And probably also an opportunity to enhance your overall skill as a writer and journalist, right? Like I've always really enjoying the process of translation. I find it very creative, and it requires various nuanced kind of understanding of character, intention, cultural, and also style, right? Style, and I think it is a kind of a setting where basically you are pushed, to always strive for better in a way, and of course, language itself is evolving so much, and nowadays, we work very much in, multiple, scopes, not just 2D, 3D, but also, the digital space, digital realm. Maybe I'll have just one more question because I think the audience, we've taken 3 questions. So what's your view on the impact of AI in the professional journalism and art writing?
You really want to end on this one?
But I feel like we couldn't escape it, can we?
Thoughts? You said.
AI does a really good job in translating.
It does.
In translation. And so I think we just can't stop it from getting. I mean, it's just there. We just cannot pretend it doesn't exist, and also, but at the same time, I think it's still a very infant stage, although it's already done like quite a lot. I think we're just in the process of understanding AI and trying to find a way to get help from AI to help me do my work. Of course, and ideally, I would love AI to do my laundry and wash my dishes so that I can do the writing. But then I think the strategy that I have is to try to understand it and get help from them, from AI, without letting AI interfere with my writing process too much. I think, like for example, because I cover the art market, so data analysis, I do data like all the time. So they can do like the numbers for me, like for example, that like they can do a spreadsheet for me because that would save me like a lot of time. And so that aspect, it helps. But I'm not sure about when it comes to exhibition review, art criticism.
It can like do a facility. What's that word? Facility. Like it can make a kind of approximation of an exhibition review but it's very much kind of like art speak, because it's just kind of combing this kind of saying like, you know, shit in, shit out kind of thing. So it's like, if there's so much jargon in the art world, and so AI is of course just like feeding that jargon, like giving you that jargon back. I agree with it, like just this week, one of my colleagues posted a new story to our kind of Slack account where a book list for the summer had been like a syndicated book list, so it went around all of these newspapers that had turned out to be written by AI, just featured books that didn't exist yet. Or didn't exist. Did you hear about this?
Yeah.
And so we were kind of jokingly just writing back like, okay, it looks like we have a job for another few years, you know? Like at the moment, yeah, it's a kind of, it can be used as kind of like a tool. I've heard other friends that have said like, oh, when there's like an artist list from say the Venice Biennale, you can dump that in AI and then say like, oh, can you put this in alphabetical order, please? Or like these types of tasks that you can use. And I think like copy editing, we talked a little bit before about language, and I think that if you don't speak English as a first language, and it can be kind of helpful. But the way that I've been using it at the moment is kind of like a bit more like feeding things in line by line, rather than kind of like, yeah, giving over control in terms of just being like, edit this or whatever. But in terms of copy editing and kind of grammar and word choice, sometimes like you can be sitting there at your computer and you're like, okay, you've used the same word twice and you just can't think of a different word, and you can be like, what other word could I use, or something like this. You know, there's these kind of things in which like, but yeah, I'm also a little bit scared about relying too much and kind of getting like lazy. I think it will already affect things like, I think jobs like copywriting, for example, will just not exist for very much longer. Copy editing, I think, will probably also go by the wayside, unfortunately, because even though they do, copy editors is very important. As magazines are kind of squeezed and have less money for things, I do think that we'll see people relying more on that, but we're also seeing the damage of this. There's so many kind of stories that are funny, but also not funny at all, about kind of like lawyers presenting kind of case studies that then the lawyer's like, the judge is like, well, what is this? And then it turns out that they just used AI, and AI just made up case studies, you know? So I think that like there's ways in which lazy use of this of this technology can be very, very dangerous, and I think that it's still not a replacement for a kind of, a thoroughly researched article,
And relationship with people, right? Relationship with people, with galleries, artists, and especially long-standing relationships. Really understand the inside out of a person or institution's history, struggle, and all of that. I've certainly enjoyed both of your talk, our conversation, and also our audience. Thank you so much also for spending this afternoon with us. I hope you have enjoyed this conversation. And some of you have visited us before, so we have lots of new programs coming up. I would just like to mention, in terms of Cantonese opera, we have a regular Cantonese opera singing workshop, actually. Oh, wow. Usually it's catered for our ECR club, so that's an ongoing project for East and Southeast Asian elders, so people like over the age of 50, based in Great Manchester. But we have an upcoming event that's open for public booking as well. You find it on our website. That's in collaboration with the Liverpool Biennial. So on the 7th of June, I think it's a Saturday, we're going to welcome a Canadian Chinese artist, Karen Tam, who's going to reveal her installation in Liverpool. She's coming over to give an artist talk, and it will be followed by a Cantonese opera singing workshop, and it's open for public booking. So I hope to see some of you there as well. And please join me to thank Chloe and Vivienne for this really fantastic conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invite.
Thank you.